The New Orleans Saints finished the 2024 season with a 5-12 record and missed the playoffs for the fourth straight year.
While the Saints aren't in uncharted territory, the black and gold have lost 6 straight games, their longest losing streak since the Katrina season.
The Saints' over-under win total was just 7.5 entering 2024, so it wouldn't have been a surprise to anyone to say they would have missed the playoffs prior to the 24 season starting, but with how they started last year, with back-to-back 40-plus point games and back-to-back 25-plus point wins.
Alvin Kamara, room to roll. Alvin Kamara's gonna score. Touchdown.
Only to go 3-12 the rest of the way. Well, I think it can be argued this was a disappointing season, all things considered. And after starting 2-0, they lost 7 straight games, and former head coach Dennis Allen was fired. They would go on to win back-to-back games with interim coach Darren Rizzi as they defeated the Falcons 20-17 in Week 10 and the Browns 35-14 in Week 11, but it was too little too late. Former starting quarterback Derek Carr also missed some time throughout the middle of the 24 season due to an oblique injury, then eventually played his last NFL game against the Giants in Week 14. Derek Carr eventually retired in May of 2025, and there was a lot that took place for the Saints this offseason. They hired a new head coach in Kellen Moore, and they also drafted a quarterback in the second round in Louisville's Tyler Shuck. And there is a lot of uncertainty surrounding the 2025 Saints, and that's why I thought the title of today's video made a tremendous amount of sense, and that's where do we start with the New Orleans Saints, and what should we expect from this year? Well, we're going to break it all down in today's video, and before we start, if you could like the video, I would really appreciate it as it helps the channel tremendously. Now let's begin. And like we do with every NFL team preview, we are starting with who the Saints brought in and who they lost in free agency. We of course have to start with the coaching change, as the Saints are now coached by Kellen Moore, an offensive-minded coach who has coached several quarterbacks like Dak Prescott, Justin Herbert, and Super Bowl champion Jalen Hurts, to name a few. Now, one big thing that needs to be noted with the 2025 Saints, and why this is going to be a long rebuild process for them, is due in large part to money. Per both Spotrac and Over the Cap, they have $87 million on the books in dead cap money entering 2025, which is second most in the NFL, only behind the 49ers. And whenever you have that much money going towards players not playing for your team, inevitably that's going to limit what you're going to be able to do. And full transparency, I do have more hope for this team in 26, but with where this roster is now, combined with how limited they were going to be entering 2025, I have very low expectations for the 2025 Saints. They have Marshawn Lattimore, Derek Carr, Ryan Ramczyk, Michael Thomas, and Jameis Winston on the books for a combined $78.5 million in 2025. Now, I have criticized GM Mickey Loomis in the past for, well, a lot of things, but you really can't control what happened to Ryan Ramczyk and Michael Thomas in those specific situations, and I do credit the Loom for trading Marshawn Lattimore and getting something for him while he still could. I didn't like the Derek Carr signing from the start, and he is now retired. Now, we had to preface the Saints free agency portion of the video with that because you may have wondered where all their money went, especially when you look at their roster entering the year. But the biggest signing they had this offseason was bringing back Chase Young on a 3-year deal worth up to $51 million, with $33 being guaranteed. I like this deal for both sides, and I know Chase Young hasn't lived up to who he was billed to be as the number 2 overall pick coming out of Ohio State, but to act like he is a bad player is simply wrong. He's had back-to-back 65-plus pressure seasons, and there is no team that would deny that type of production. And his 66 pressures last year were actually 9th in the entire NFL. So again, to bring back a 26-year-old pass rusher who can consistently get after the quarterback on what is essentially a 2-year deal was a good move for New Orleans. They also brought back tight end Juwan Johnson on a 3-for-30 deal, and I was surprised by this deal as I didn't think Juwan Johnson was going to get $10 million per year, and also the fact the Saints gave him $21 million guaranteed. And for as much as I liked the Chase Young signing, I felt the same way in the opposite direction about the Juwan Johnson signing. They also brought in former Chief safety Justin Reed, and I think this is an upgrade for the Saints defense at a position that desperately needed it, and it's a bonus Justin Reed is from Louisiana, so I do think this was a good signing for the Saints in the grand scheme of things. They upgraded at a position of need and did not overspend in the process. Now, they also brought back 2014 first-round selection Brandon Cooks, and this is a player whose production has fallen off over the past few years and has not had a 1,000-yard season since back in 2021, so I wouldn't expect too much from him, but it is fun for Saints fans who used to love Brandon Cooks now that they have him back on their team. I also really like the value of the Julian Blackmon signing too, a safety who came over from the Colts. They lost corner Paulson Adebo to the Giants in free agency, who signed a 3-for-54 deal with them, and several players signed one-year deals in various locations. Receiver Marquez Valdes-Scantling signed a one-year $4 million deal to go to Seattle, and former first-round pick Peyton Turner signed a one-year deal with the Cowboys. Overall, it wasn't too busy of a free agency period for the Saints, and despite the limited capital they had, I still think they raised the floor of this team by bringing in both Justin Reid and Julian Blackmon. They also traded for nose tackle Davon Godchaux, which was a position they desperately needed, in March for a 2026 7th round pick. Now, what should we realistically expect from the 2025 Saints defense? Well, this has the potential to be a long year for this unit, and one thing I did want to add to the players the Saints brought in or lost this offseason was the retirement of Tyrann Mathieu, and while he may not have been an All-Pro at 32 years old, that is over 1,000 snaps the Saints have to replace this year. And one of the Saints' biggest problems last year was they couldn't stop the run. They finished 30th in both defensive rushing DVOA and defensive rushing EPA per play, and what's kind of funny about that is they allowed less than 70 yards rushing in each of the first two games of the year last year. They put up 91 total points in those games, so they got up pretty quickly against the Panthers and Cowboys, and they didn't run the ball against the Saints. And they allowed less than 100 yards rushing in a game in just 3 of the 15 remaining games. Not only that, but they couldn't force turnovers either, as they forced just 17 in all of 2024, and they forced 5 in the first 2 games of the year alone, meaning they forced just 12 in the final 15 games, and when you can't stop the run and can't force turnovers, well, you're in for a long year. And just because they traded for Davon Godchaux this offseason doesn't mean he is the long-term solution along the interior either. Their defensive line is pretty weak entering 2025, and it's going to be something that limits this team this year. Cameron Jordan, Godchaux, and Kalen Saunders are not awful players, but I don't think anyone would say heading into 2025 that, man, I am impressed by this trio and think they're going to do great things. That also applies to Jonathan Bullard, Nathan Shepard, Brian Brzee, and Vernon Broughton for that matter too. And the fact that your defensive line going into the year is, at best, a work in progress? Well, it's coming off of a year in which you were bottom 3 in the NFL in stopping the run, and you also brought in Brandon Staley to be the team's defensive coordinator, who is notoriously known as a coach who does not defend the run well. Well, simply put, I have a lot of questions about how the Saints are going to stop the run this year. Now, I mentioned Brian Brzee during that part, and I like the idea of Brian Brzee as a pass-rushing defensive tackle, but there's times where he gets flushed out in the run game and consistently, and I think he can be a liability in run defense, and that's putting it mildly. I do like their linebackers quite a bit in Pete Werner and Demario Davis, and even their edge rushers in Carl Granderson and Chase Young, and each Granderson and Young actually had 60-plus pressures last year, but they can't be everywhere all the time, and even Saints fans would acknowledge that there were certainly long patches of games where Chase Young would disappear. Demario Davis is 36 years old, so there is a really good chance 2025 is his last year. And while Granderson and Chase Young each had 60-plus pressures last year, the interior defensive line does not get home anywhere close to the level they did in 2024. Brzee does occasionally, but not as consistently as you'd like, especially for a player that you spent a first-round pick on. And while they did improve the safety play this offseason by bringing in both Justin Reid and Julian Blackmon, I still have a lot of questions about this secondary outside of Kool-Aid McKinstry. Ugo Amadi is their nickel corner, and he allowed a career-high 109.7 opposing passer rating when targeted last year, and Lifetime has an opposing passer rating allowed of 102.7 when targeted. The Saints also released him in late August of last year, then brought him back during the 24 season, if that gives you an idea of how they felt about him initially. And this is unfortunate for Alontae Taylor, who has been good at points in his career in the slot, but the Saints kicked him outside last year, and whenever Alontae Taylor was forced to play outside, his numbers dropped significantly. He had the worst year of his career and had an opposing passer rating of 117.9 when targeted in 2024. The Saints' corner depth is a big question, but I really worry about the team's run defense, and specifically the interior defensive line, and there's times in football where it's very simple. If you can't stop the run, nothing else matters, and there's a very good chance that's what happens to the Saints in 2025. This has all the makings to being a long year, and what also has to be remembered for the Saints' defense is the complementary football aspect, and I don't think the Saints' 2025 offense is going to be that good in terms of positioning the Saints' 2025 defense for success. I hope I'm wrong, but from a projection standpoint, I think the Saints defense will be in the 25 to 32 range this year. The 2025 Saints should have pretty considerable rookie impact, and their draft started with the selection of Texas offensive tackle Kelvin Banks. Now, I have been critical of Saints GM Mickey Loomis in the past, but I really do want to credit him for what he's done in each of the previous first 2 rounds. They selected Oregon State offensive tackle Talisi Fuaga in the first round of 2024, and of course Kelvin Banks this year, and there's a very real reality where Kelvin Banks and Talisi Fuaga anchor each side of the offensive line, not just for 2025, but I think there is a reality where they are still anchoring the offensive line in 2030 and beyond. I love Talisi Fuaga coming out of Oregon State last year. I thought he was a mean, nasty player, and there were multiple plays early in the 24 season where he was getting out and mowing guys down at the run game, and while Kelvin Banks is not a mauler in the run game the way Talisi Fuaga is, he is a rock-solid tackle and a player that I thought had a really good anchor for Texas in 2024, and I thought he did a really good job of mirroring pass rushers' moves, and he technically allowed 1 sack in 2024, but that sack was really on Quinn Ewers, and it was by no means on Kelvin Banks at all. And this is a 21-year-old rookie that I think is going to kind of hit the ground running, and a player that should have a solid rookie year and really build on that in 2026. So again, I have been critical of Mickey Loomis in the past, but I really do want to credit him for what he's done in each of the previous first 2 rounds, which, as simple as it is, it's drafting big, strong football players that are going to be there for not just a year or 2, but hopefully the next 5 or 6 years, and that's something that the Saints have not done a good job of over the past few years, but I really like their offensive tackle duo and think that they could be one of the better duos by season's end and should undoubtedly be one of the best tackle duos entering 2026 and especially 2027. Now, we did give the 25 Saints draft class a B+ draft grade whenever draft grades were initially released, as I really liked what they did on day 1 of the 25 draft. I think they have a future franchise left tackle, and I actually really like several players, not just one, but several players that they selected on day 3, but I thought there was a lot to be desired for on day 2 of the draft. They have a top 40 selection, and they selected a 26-year-old quarterback, and I kind of question what is Tyler Shuck's ceiling going to be with this team, because right now, the reality, at least for me, entering 2025 is you look at this team, you look at the players on this team, and they're not very good. And I don't think Tyler Shuck is going to be a floor raiser where he's going to come in and throw 25 touchdowns as a rookie and have this team go from a 3 or 4 win season to a 7 or 8 win team that we can legitimately build around Tyler Shuck, especially with a loaded 2026 quarterback class. There were a lot better players on the board at their respective position, and I don't think Tyler Shuck is going to be a dart throw at pick 40 that is going to prove to work out for this team. And there's also rumors right now coming out of Saints camp that Spencer Rattler is clear and away the quarterback 1, so I think in a lot of ways there's a reality where they burned a top 40 pick on a not even developmental quarterback because he's already 26 years old, or will be 26 years old late in the 25 season. So whenever you are selecting a quarterback that was born in the 1900s in the year 2025, I think you have to be pretty certain about who the player is, and I don't really like the value for where the Saints selected him at pick 40 relative to his role for this team in 25 and beyond. My biggest thing with Tyler Shuck being selected at number 40 overall, which is a player that I had at player 81 on my big board, is kind of this infinity IQ. Did we draft him so that we can ensure that we have a top 3 or 4 selection in the 2026 draft? Because if that is anybody's thought process, that's a really, really bad thought process, because there's a lot better players that you can have contribute for your football team than selecting a 25 going on 26-year-old rookie quarterback. And maybe there's this infinity IQ idea that, hey, Doug Nussmeier is our offensive coordinator, and Garrett Nussmeier is LSU's quarterback right now, who is projected to be a first-round selection, and that we can pair Doug and Garrett next year with the 2026 Saints because of the Tyler Shuck selection. I'm not buying any of that. I just didn't like the value, and I really question what his ceiling is with a team that is already not good to begin with. Now, third-round selection Vernon Broughton, I don't think will have all that much rookie impact, and it's mainly from a transition period to the NFL of going from the college level to the NFL level, and there's also a couple of players in front of him. Not that he's a bad player, and I know we discussed him a little bit during the defensive portion, but I think that there will be a path for him in 2026. I just don't think he's going to be on the field all that much in 2025, and I would not have high expectations for third-round selection Vernon Broughton. But day 3 for the Saints is where I liked not just one pick, but multiple picks for the 2025 Saints draft class. The Saints did have one final day 2 selection, which was Virginia DB Jonas Sanker, and I do not dislike Jonas Sanker as a football player, as I think he brings a lot of value to a team. He's a versatile DB that can play whether single high, two high, he can even play down in the slot a bit. I just don't think he's going to have that much rookie impact with the signings of Justin Reed and Julian Blackmon, and I kind of question the 93rd selection in the draft specifically on Jonas Sanker. I had him around player 150 on my big board, so I didn't think the value aligned, though I don't think he's a bad football player, and I also think he'll contribute on special teams, and that he'll be proved to be worth a selection in the long run. I just wouldn't expect all that much from a rookie contribution standpoint. Now, for the Saints day 3 selections, I really did like Danny Stutzman, the 4th round linebacker from Oklahoma. I think he's a really solid player and an instinctual player that will learn behind Demario Davis, and again, I have criticized Mickey Loomis in the past, but I do give credit where it's due, and I think this is going to be kind of the heir to Demario Davis's throne, or at least a player that will come in and replace Demario Davis, and I obviously don't want a 4th round selection to have the expectations that Demario Davis had for the majority of his career, but you get where I'm coming from. I like the selection of Stutzman and think that this is a clear replacement plan for inevitably when Demario Davis retires. I did like the selection of Quincy Riley as well, as I think he's a feisty DB from Louisville, and anytime you can have a feisty DB late on day 3 that's going to bring the energy and really bring that fight back in the secondary for a team that I think could use the energy and fight from a player like Quincy Riley that will also have meaningful and contributive snaps over the course of his rookie contract. Again, like that selection, and I also really like the selection of Kansas running back Devin Neal. I had Devin Neal at player 107 on my big board, and they selected him at pick 186, so obviously that was tremendous value there for Mickey Loomis. And with the day 3 selections of Danny Stutzman, Quincy Riley, and Devin Neal was a player who ran for over 4,000 yards during his time at Kansas and averaged over 3.7 yards after contact in 2024, along with even the 254th selection of the draft in Syracuse pass rusher Fadil Diggs. I thought the Saints did a good job. The only question that I had was on day 2 of the 25 draft, but with Kelvin Banks, Danny Stutzman, Quincy Riley, and Devin Neal, I really like what this Saints class represents and where I think they will be in 2026. I just question how much true rookie impact they'll have, mainly because of guys ahead of them on the depth chart, but overall for what this draft class represents in 2026 and beyond, I thought the Saints did a really good job throughout the 2025 draft. There needs to be a lot of context around the 2025 Saints offense because I don't think it's as simple as Spencer Rattler's probably not going to be good. Tyler Shuck was selected in the 2nd round of a quarterback class that was already not very good and a draft class that wasn't very good. So therefore, the 2025 Saints season is over. They're going to win 3 games and we're on to 2026. I don't think it is as simple as that. And with Spencer Rattler specifically, he was not in a position to succeed last year from a situation standpoint, whether it was his offensive line because the offensive line wasn't fully healthy, whether it was the receivers, not being very good, or with Spencer himself making bad decisions. And I think all of those things can be true. I know people at times want to place it specifically on the offensive line or specifically on the play caller or whatever the case may be, right? But some of the mistakes Spencer made last year had nothing to do with whether his receiver was Jerry Rice or whoever he was throwing to. They were rookie mistakes and they were bad decisions. There was one play in particular against the Packers where the Saints were running a play action leak concept and Spencer threw the ball to the leak part of the route, which was to Foster Moreau on the backside of the play, and it wasn't a complete across the body, across the middle type throw that, you think of Brett Favre in the 2009 NFC Championship game, but it was a play where he specifically set his feet from far hash, turned, threw across the field right into double coverage, and it was a completely ill-advised throw when he had an option right in front of him for a couple of yard gain. Whether the receiver on that play or tight end in that matter was Jimmy Graham or Foster Moreau, that pass was not going to be completed, and that was on Spencer Rattler. Now, the Saints obviously got their rear ends handed to them in that game, as with a rookie quarterback and a day 3 rookie quarterback going into Lambeau late in the year was not going to be a recipe for success. I don't think it's all of a sudden going to flip around in 2025 and that Spencer Rattler is going to go from a project quarterback to a superstar in 1 year. Yes, there were moments for him last year and during his rookie season, but I have a lot of questions pertaining to the 2025 Saints, and again, it doesn't have a lot to do with Spencer Rattler, more so the supporting cast around him, and that's going to be an unfortunate thing that follows the 2025 Saints is a 30-year-old Alvin Kamara, and specifically the receiving core outside of Chris Olave. And one of the biggest reasons as to why I'm kind of out on the 2025 Saints offense before it begins is the playmakers, again, outside of Chris Olave. I know Rashid Shaheed can provide some fun plays and some highlight plays, but he's not a legit number 2 receiver that I think can consistently win, and a guy that can have an 800 or 900 yard year, and a player that you legitimately want to build around. And there's a couple of numbers that I would like to provide to back that up. Last year, he was targeted 40 times in the limited time that he played, and 4 interceptions were thrown. And this is a player that has 150 targets in his career, and whenever he's been targeted in his career, 7 interceptions have been thrown while he's being targeted, and I don't think that's a coincidence. He was also 0 of 7 uncontested catch opportunities last year, so with Rashid Shaheed, this is almost a player where you are specifically manufacturing touches, or he's wide open on a deep ball, because if there's a contested catch, statistically speaking, he is probably not going to win that said contested catch opportunity. Alvin Kamara had one great game against the Cowboys last year, and he did have a 150-yard game against the Panthers last year, but outside of those 2 games, and even within the Panthers game, that was a defense that was one of the worst over the past 5 years, so I don't think with another year added onto his body, along with all of the touches that he had last year, that he's all of a sudden going to turn the clock back a couple of years, and that Kamara will rush for 1,000 yards for the first time in his career. I'm also not sold on this tight end room, and I look at Juwan Johnson as a player, and I don't think there's anything he does particularly great, although he is a more athletic tight end because he was a receiver in college, so the fact that he is a receiver converted tight end allows him to be a bit more of a vertical threat, but I don't think he's that great of a vertical threat to the point where you are fearing Juwan Johnson as opposing defensive coordinator sitting up on Saturday night thinking, man, how are we going to stop him? And Saints fans especially know with his contested catch percentage and ability for that matter. But when you look at the 2025 Saints offense, I can't help but think that this is going to be a very limited offense. But as a fan, if I were heading into the year, I would kind of view that in a positive light, because anything that we have from Kelvin Banks or Talisi Fuaga, if we select a quarterback in the first round of the 26th draft, guess what? We probably have our tackle duo of the future. And I would also like to see Devin Neal featured in this offense more and more as the season goes on, because if I were a Saints fan heading into 2025, I would look at all of the young talent that we have, like the tackle duo, and Chris Olave is still a pretty young player, and hope that Kendre Miller or Devin Neal breaks out, and hopefully we have a couple of fun moments from Spencer Rattler too, and that this season is going to be fun a lot more than getting our rear ends kicked every single week. Now, when you ask the simple question of, hey, do I think the Saints are going to outscore the Tampa Bay Buccaneers in Tampa, or even in New Orleans for that matter? The answer is going to be no, as the Bucs to me are a more talented team, and that should not be a hot take, and inevitably that's going to apply not just to the Bucs versus the Saints, but really for several other teams, and I don't think they're going to win many games this year, as a lot of people don't think they're going to win many games. So while the ceiling may not be high for this team entering 2025, it's going to be about the progression of not just the players, but ultimately with Kellen Moore and the coaching staff too. I hope Brandon Staley works out as the team's defensive coordinator, but I have my questions there, specifically because of how his tenure was with the Chargers, of course, and then most recently with the 49ers, and how their run defense was with him on the coaching staff too. So I hope everything works out for the Saints in the long run. Obviously, we don't expect too much from the 2025 Saints, and I think their ceiling is going to be rather low, between 5 and 6 wins. But that's all I have for today. I hope you enjoyed, and if you did, please like and subscribe, as we finally hit the 200,000 subscriber mark, and I cannot thank you guys enough for the support. I am very humbled to reach the 200,000 subscriber mark, and it could not have been done without your guys' support. So until next time, please be safe and have a great day. Love you guys.